Story number 1.
I had always loved the solitude of winter camping, the stark beauty of snow-covered forests, the quiet stillness of a world blanketed in white. It was a way for me to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. I planned for this particular trip for months, studying weather reports and mapping out the route to my favorite remote campsite in the Cascade Range. I'd been there before, but this time would be different. A snowstorm was predicted to hit around the time I'd arrive. I wasn't worried. I had experience camping in harsh conditions, and I felt confident I could handle whatever nature threw at me. After all, what was winter camping without a little challenge? I set out on my hike with my backpack loaded, my gear ready, and my spirits high. The wind was already picking up as I ascended the mountain, the snow falling in large, heavy flakes. It was clear the storm was starting earlier than expected, but I still felt good about making it to the campsite before nightfall. I'd been hiking for hours, the trail steadily climbing as the snow deepened. The silence of the forest was beautiful, almost oppressive, as the sound of my boots crunching through the snow echoed around me. But something felt off. It was subtle, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a sense that I was being watched. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was nothing, just the isolation playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't fade. It only grew stronger the deeper I went to the wilderness. I pressed on, eager to reach the safety of my camp, telling myself the weather was just making me paranoid. By the time I reached my destination, the snowstorm had intensified. The visibility was almost zero, the wind howling through the trees, snow swirling around me in a chaotic blur. I struggled to set up my tent, my fingers numb from the cold, the storm making it nearly impossible to see anything. I anchored the tent down as best as I could, securing it with stakes buried deep in the snow. I built a small fire just outside the entrance, the flames flickering weakly against the wind. I huddled close to the fire, wrapped in my sleeping bag, hoping the warmth would settle my nerves. As night fell, the storm raged on. The wind battered the sides of the tent, and the fire seemed to shrink under the relentless assault of snow and ice. I sat there, staring into the flames, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, imagining shapes in the swirling snow outside. I heard something, a faint sound like a voice carried by the wind. I froze, straining to listen. It was distant at first, hard to make out, but it grew louder. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, barely audible above the sound of the wind. I thought I might have imagined it. After all, the storm had a way of distorting sounds, turning every crack and creak into something unfamiliar. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, help me." I stood up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. The snow was falling in thick sheets and the wind had only grown stronger. I unzipped the tent flap, stepping out into the storm. I called into the darkness, my voice barely audible. "Hello, is someone out there?" I listened intently, my breath clouding in front of me. The wind roared, but there was no response. For a moment I thought I had imagined it, that the storm was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, the faint, urgent voice. "Help. Please." It was coming from somewhere nearby, just outside the range of my flashlight. I grabbed the beam and aimed it into the swirling snow. My heart raced as I stepped farther away from the safety of my tent, my boots crunching in the deep snow. I called out again, my voice hoarse. "Who's out there? What's going on?" The voice stopped, and I thought I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate. My pulse quickened. I was alone out here, miles from the nearest town or trail. The idea of another hiker out here, stranded in the storm, filled me with dread. But something didn't feel right. The voice was wrong, too soft, too faint, like it was coming from a distance, even though it was so close. I moved cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick snow. The footsteps continued, but I couldn't see anyone. The sound of them moving was just to my left, then behind me, then in front of me again. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was circling me. "Hello?" I called again, but there was no answer. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, like my breath hitching in my throat. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. The snowstorm was so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. It was like the world had disappeared, leaving me alone in a void of white. I took another step, and then, Crunch. My boots sank into something soft, something I hadn't seen in the deep snow. My heart stopped as I looked down, the beam of my flashlight revealing something in the snow. A hand. Frozen, lifeless fingers curled up from the white blanket of snow. I stumbled back in shock, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one around, no one to claim the hand, no body to accompany it, just the deep, empty snow. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to move. The hand wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It had to be an illusion created by the storm, my mind playing tricks on me. But then the voice came again, faint but clear, cutting through the wind and snow. Help, please. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping and ran toward my tent, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The footsteps continued behind me, getting closer with every step I took. I reached the tent, my hands shaking as I scrambled to unzip it. I collapsed inside, slamming the flap shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long time I lay there, listening to the storm rage outside, but there was no more sound of footsteps, no more whispers. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it had all been a product of the storm, my imagination getting the best of me. But I couldn't shake the image of the hand in the snow. It was too vivid, too real. And as I lay there in the pitch-black silence of the tent, I could still feel the presence, something out there, something watching me. I didn't sleep that night. The storm continued to howl outside, and the eerie sensation of being watched never left. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I saw shadows moving just beyond the fabric of the tent, and every time I listened closely, I thought I could hear the faintest whisper in the wind. When the storm finally subsided by dawn, I packed up my things in a rush, barely taking the time to break down my tent properly. I didn't want to be there anymore. The thought of staying even a moment longer filled me with dread. I couldn't explain it. There was nothing tangible, nothing I could point to as proof that I wasn't just imagining things. But I knew what I felt, and I knew I needed to leave. As I made my way back down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still watching me from the shadows of the trees. I had heard stories about ghostly figures in the mountains, lost souls who wandered the wilderness, but I never believed in that kind of thing. Now, I wasn't so sure. The storm had passed, but the memories stayed with me. I never went back to that spot, and I never camped in that area again. I still don't know who or what I encountered in the storm that night, but I know this. There are some things in the wilderness that you shouldn't try to understand. Story the end.
Story number 2.
We had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was the kind of adventure we needed to escape the noise of the city. A weekend getaway in the remote wilderness of the White Mountains, just me, Sarah, and my old college friend, Ben. We were seasoned hikers, having done dozens of trips together over the years, but none of us had ever ventured out in the winter before. The idea of snow-covered forests and untouched trails felt like the perfect opportunity to break free from the routine. The weather forecast had called for a light snowstorm. Nothing too serious, just a couple of inches here and there. It sounded like a cozy adventure, especially with the thought of sitting around a campfire in the quiet woods, the snow gently falling around us. But looking back, I wonder if that first forecast should have been a warning. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, and by the time we had packed our gear and started the hike, the snow had already begun falling in heavier sheets. The trail quickly became slippery, and the wind began to pick up, but we shrugged it off. We were prepared, after all. Our backpacks were heavy with all the essentials: sleeping bags, a tent, food, and enough warm layers to withstand the cold. By the time we reached the campsite, the snow had thickened, and the world around us had become a blur of white. The trees towered over us, their branches bending under the weight of the snow. We found a small clearing near a frozen creek where we could set up the tent. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We worked quickly, setting up the tent as the wind howled around us, the snow falling faster than we had anticipated. By the time we were done, it felt like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour. We huddled inside the tent, trying to warm up with a small camp stove and the last of our supplies. Outside, the storm was intensifying, and the trees groaned under the pressure of the wind. I don't know about you guys, but this is worse than I expected, Ben said, rubbing his hands together. I thought it was just going to be a few flakes, but this is a full-blown snowstorm. It's all right, I said, trying to sound optimistic. It'll pass. Just a few hours and we'll be fine. Sarah, who was usually the most cautious of the group, had been quiet for most of the evening. Her eyes kept darting to the entrance of the tent, as if she were listening for something beyond the howling wind. "You guys hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice low and tense. I looked up. The wind was loud, but there was something else. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, carried through the storm. It was distant at first, but it became clearer. It wasn't the wind. "Who's out there?" Ben called into the storm, but there was no response. We waited, holding our breath. The whisper faded, but the tension in the air didn't lift. Something about the sound had felt wrong. It wasn't like the usual animal noises we'd heard on past trips, no owls or rustling of small creatures in the snow. This was different. I shrugged it off. It's probably just the wind. Sometimes the storm makes everything sound weird. But Sarah wasn't convinced. No, it sounded like someone calling, like they were lost. "Stop freaking out," Ben said. "We're fine. It's just a storm. Let's try to sleep." But none of us were able to sleep. The wind howled relentlessly outside, and every time the tent would shift in the wind, I would think I heard that whisper again. "Help! Help!" It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill through me every time it reached my ears. By the time the storm was at its peak, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there, just beyond the tent, waiting. But every time I tried to reassure myself, the feeling would only grow stronger. Around midnight, Sarah's voice broke the silence again. "I swear I saw something moving outside." I froze. "What do you mean? What did you see?" "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "A shadow, moving between the trees. It was tall, almost like a person, but it didn't move right. It was wrong." I turned to Ben, but he wasn't saying anything. His face was pale, his eyes wide with uncertainty. For a moment, none of us spoke. The storm raged on outside, and the whispering sound seemed to intensify, circling our tent like a ghost. I could feel my heartbeat thumping in my chest. "It's probably just the snow. The storm is playing tricks on us." But Sarah didn't look convinced. "No, this was something else. I've been out here enough to know when something's off." We tried to laugh it off, but I could feel my nerves on edge. It was as though the storm had somehow changed the whole atmosphere. The wind was no longer just a storm. It felt like a force pushing against us, as though the woods themselves were closing in. Just as we started to settle back down, there was a loud noise outside. The heck, like something heavy had crashed into the ground. It shook the tent, and the wind intensified, howling even louder than before. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry, "but I think we need to get out of here." We tried to stay calm, but as I grabbed my coat and got ready to leave the tent, something froze me in place. The whispering. It was right outside the tent now, clear and loud, like someone was standing just a few feet away. "Help," it breathed. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't human. It was low, rasping, like something trying to speak after years of silence. And then I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps in the snow just outside the tent. The crunch of snow, like someone was walking around us, moving in circles. My heart pounded in my chest as I held the flashlight tight, my grip sweating. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Do you hear that?" She nodded, her face pale with fear. "What do we do?" Before I could answer, the tent shook again, this time more violently, as if something had slammed into it. The air felt colder, like the temperature had dropped in an instant. The wind was still howling, but the snow had stopped. It was just still. A shadow loomed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It moved closer to the tent, growing larger and darker. The footsteps stopped, but I could still hear the breathing, low and rasping, just beyond the fabric of the tent. And then there was silence. The shadow didn't move anymore. There was nothing. No wind, no snow, no sounds. Just a suffocating stillness. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed Ben's arm, yanking him toward the opening of the tent. "We're leaving. Now." We stumbled out into the snowstorm, the cold biting into our skin, but none of us dared to look back. The forest was empty, silent once more. The trail was barely visible, and the snow had begun to pile up in inches. But we had no choice. We had to get out. We didn't speak much as we made our way down the mountain. Our feet were numb from the cold, and our bodies screamed from the exertion, but none of us looked back. The snowstorm had quieted, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as though something in the woods had been waiting for us to leave, waiting for us to give up our place in that silent, suffocating space. We made it to the car just before dawn, our clothes soaked through, our faces pale and tired. We didn't speak much on the drive home. None of us had the words for what we had experienced, but we all knew we would never return to those woods. We never spoke of that night again, but I still hear that whisper sometimes. On the wind. Help. Story the end.
Story number 3.
We had always prided ourselves on being the adventurous type. My best friend Laura and I. After years of weekend camping trips and hiking through various national parks, we wanted something different, something a little more isolated, a little more wild. We chose a spot deep in the Adirondacks, a remote area known for its untouched beauty. The weather forecast predicted a light snowstorm, which we didn't think would be a big deal. A little snow, a cozy campfire, and some hot cocoa. How could it go wrong? We packed our gear the night before, and with everything loaded up, we drove up to the trailhead early the next morning. The drive was uneventful. Just winding mountain roads covered in thin layers of snow, the kind you expect when winter hasn't quite settled in yet. The kind that makes you feel like you're entering a winter wonderland. Little did we know, the storm would hit harder than predicted. The first few miles of the hike were picturesque, but the deeper we went into the woods, the thicker the snow became. By the time we reached the campsite, a light dusting had turned into a full-blown snowstorm. The wind howled through the trees, pushing the snow around us in swirling gusts. We found a clearing by a creek to set up our tent, and with some effort, we got everything set up before the storm really picked up. Inside the tent, we set up our sleeping bags and a small camp stove, but the warmth from the stove barely seemed to penetrate the cold air. The wind outside grew louder, and we could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on us. Laura, usually the calm one in situations like this, kept glancing nervously out of the tent. "I don't like how quiet it is," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "No birds, nothing. It's too still." I laughed it off. "It's just the storm. Animals tend to hunker down in bad weather." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled over me. The snow had muffled everything, and the eerie quiet felt unsettling. The wind howled, but beyond that, there was nothing. No crackling of branches, no rustling of animals in the woods, just the storm. We spent the evening in the tent, eating canned soup and talking about everything and nothing. But I couldn't help but feel like something wasn't right. The storm outside seemed to come from nowhere, growing fiercer with each passing hour. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, like footsteps in the snow. But when I'd look, there was nothing, just the storm. Around 10 p.m., the wind picked up to a deafening roar. I tried to close my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The howling wind made it impossible to ignore, and the eerie feeling that something was wrong kept creeping into my thoughts. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it might have been the wind. "Help!" I sat up quickly, my heart pounding. I glanced over at Laura. She was wide awake, staring at me, her eyes wide with fear. "You heard that, right?" she whispered, barely audible over the howling wind. I nodded, my throat dry. It wasn't the wind. It was too distinct. We sat in silence, listening. The whisper came again, closer this time, like it was right outside the tent. "Help?" I felt my skin crawl. "It's probably just the wind," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Laura wasn't so sure. "I don't like this. Something's wrong. We should leave." I considered it. The storm was intense, but we weren't exactly in a situation where we could just leave without a plan. Plus, I wasn't about to let my nerves get the better of me. "It's fine," I said, though I could tell my voice was shaking. "We're fine, just a weird coincidence." But neither of us could sleep after that. We lay in our sleeping bags, wide-eyed, listening to the storm and the unsettling whispers. Every now and then I heard the sound of footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate, but when I would peek out of the tent, there was nothing there. Nothing but swirling snow and the dark shapes of trees. Around midnight, Laura finally broke. She sat up, her face pale. "I'm going outside. I have to see what's out there." "Laura, no. It's too dangerous. We don't know what's going on." But she was already unzipping the tent. I tried to stop her, but she didn't seem to hear me. She stepped out into the snowstorm, disappearing into the white flurry of wind and snow. I sat there in the tent, frozen with fear. My mind raced, trying to convince myself she was just trying to get some air, maybe take a walk to clear her head. But the storm outside felt more oppressive now, like it was closing in on me. I waited for what felt like hours, my mind playing tricks on me. Every gust of wind, every creak of the tent made me think Laura was coming back, but she didn't. Panic surged in me. I had to find her. I grabbed my flashlight, bundled up as best as I could, and stepped out into the storm, calling her name. The cold hit me like a slap in the face. The snow had accumulated rapidly, and the wind stung my skin. I tried to follow her tracks, but the storm had already erased them. The forest was eerily still. No sign of Laura, no sign of anything, just the howl of the wind and the crunch of my boots in the snow. "Laura!" I screamed, my voice lost in the wind. I stumbled through the snow, disoriented, my heart pounding. The darkness was thick, and the only sound was the rush of the storm. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches like dark fingers reaching out of the snow. Then I heard it, the whisper again. This time it was louder. It wasn't coming from one direction, it seemed to be coming from everywhere. "Help!" I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing. Nothing but the snowstorm. I was about to turn back when I saw something. A shadow, just beyond the trees, moving slowly, purposefully. "Laura?" I called, my voice hoarse. The figure stopped. It didn't move in any way that seemed natural. It was too still, too perfect in its stillness. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it wasn't Laura. The shadow was too tall, too thin, and as I watched, it seemed to lean forward slightly, almost as if it was watching me. I turned and ran. I ran back toward the camp, heart pounding in my chest. The snow stung my face, but I didn't stop. I could feel the figure behind me, but I didn't dare look. I reached the tent, breathless, and zipped myself inside. The storm raged on, but I felt like I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't explain. The night passed in agonizing silence, the storm slowly dying down by the morning. But when the light of dawn broke through the snow, Laura still hadn't returned. I packed everything up in a daze, trying to fight back the panic that threatened to overtake me. The whispers still echoed in my ears, and every gust of wind felt like it was carrying her voice, calling for help from the darkness. I hiked out of the woods as fast as I could, my mind racing. I had to get back to the car. I had to find Laura. When I reached the trailhead, I collapsed on the ground, but she wasn't there. The authorities were called, and they searched the woods for days. But there was no sign of her. No tracks. No sign of struggle. Nothing. The storm had erased everything. I'll never know what happened that night. They said it was just a tragic accident, that the storm had disoriented her, but I know better. Something was out there. Something had been waiting for us, and sometimes when the wind howls through the trees, I still hear her voice. Help. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snow had started falling lightly when we set up camp in the clearing, just past the tree line. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Me, my younger brother Kevin, and our childhood friend Mark. We had all grown up hiking together, but this was our first winter camping trip. We had checked the weather beforehand. The forecast called for light snowfall, but nothing major. We thought we were prepared. Thermal sleeping bags, extra layers, even an emergency radio. But by nightfall, the snowfall had thickened into something heavier, the wind picking up. "Maybe we should head back in the morning," Kevin said, peering out of the tent. "This is worse than I thought." "Yeah, man," Mark agreed, rubbing his hands together. "The wind's picking up bad." I nodded, but something about the night unsettled me. It wasn't just the wind. There was a strange stillness underneath it, an eerie quiet between the gusts. I tried to shake the feeling. We were 3 grown men. We had all been camping before. It was just a snowstorm. We called it a night early, hoping the weather would settle by morning. The wind howled outside, rattling the tent fabric, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. At first, I thought it was Kevin or Mark, but as I opened my eyes, I saw both of their sleeping bags were still zipped shut. The footsteps were just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. Whoever it was wasn't moving normally. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing in a circle around us. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it at the tent walls. A shadow passed by, its form distorted by the thin fabric, tall and oddly hunched. "Kevin," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned. "What? Wake up. Someone's outside." That got his attention. He sat up, and I saw Mark stir too, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Shh," I whispered. The footsteps had stopped. Mark clicked on his own flashlight. "Probably an animal." "Then why does it sound like a person?" Kevin muttered. We sat in silence for a long moment. The wind screamed outside, but the footsteps didn't return. "Whatever it was, it's gone," Mark sighed. "Go back to sleep." I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. I kept my flashlight gripped tightly in my hand, listening for any sound beyond the wind. Somewhere in the distance, I swore I heard something, a faint whisper. It sounded like my name. The next morning, we found the tracks. They weren't ours. They circled the tent, over and over, deep in the snow. But the strangest thing was that there was only one set, like someone had walked in perfect circles all night. "Jesus," Kevin muttered, rubbing his arms. "Who the hell was out here?" Mark knelt, studying the tracks. They don't lead anywhere. No starting point. No end. He was right. The prints just existed, as if someone had materialized from the snow itself. A feeling of unease settled over us. "Let's pack up," I said. "I don't want to stay another night." We moved fast, shaking the snow off our gear and packing up. By the time we were ready to go, the snowfall had thickened again. The trees looked different, darker, twisted in the storm. We started hiking back the way we came, but the trail had nearly disappeared. The storm had buried it, leaving us to navigate mostly by memory. 2 hours in, Kevin stopped suddenly. "Guys," he said, his voice shaking, "I think we're walking in circles." Mark and I exchanged looks. "No way," I said. "We've been heading straight." Kevin pointed to a small cluster of rocks near a tree. "I swear we passed that same spot earlier." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. We pushed forward, more cautiously this time, checking landmarks as we walked. But an hour later, we found ourselves back at the same clearing, back where we had camped. Our tents were gone, packed away in our bags. But the footprints? They were still there, circling in the snow. Kevin cursed under his breath. "We're lost." "We shouldn't be," Mark muttered, checking his compass. His face paled. "This thing is going nuts. The needle won't stop spinning." A heavy silence fell over us. Then, in the distance, we heard something moving. A soft, shuffling sound like something dragging through the snow. Then, voices. Whispering. I turned in every direction, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, like dozens of people speaking all at once. Then, laughter. Not joyous. Hollow. Echoing. Kevin grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." We started running. The snowfall was blinding, but we pushed forward, desperate to escape. The whispering followed us, growing louder, the laughter turning into something else, something angry. Then Mark screamed. I turned just in time to see him vanish. One moment he was there, the next, gone. The snow swallowed him whole. "Mark!" I lunged forward, but Kevin yanked me back. "Wait!" His voice was tight with panic. "Look!" I followed his gaze. The spot where Mark had disappeared, there were no tracks leading away, just empty, untouched snow, like he had never been there at all. I felt my stomach drop. Then, just ahead, something moved. A figure stood in the storm, barely visible through the swirling snow. Tall, gaunt, watching us. "Run," Kevin whispered. We ran. The storm felt endless, the trees stretching forever. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but we didn't stop. Then suddenly, we burst through the tree line. The road was there, clear, real. Kevin and I stumbled forward, panting, snow-covered. The storm seemed to stop just behind us, like an invisible wall. We turned back. The figure was gone. The footprints? Gone. And Mark was nowhere. We searched for hours, called his name until our voices were raw, but the snow had erased everything. The forest was silent. The rescue team found nothing. No trace of him. The official report said he had wandered off in the storm, that the elements had claimed him. But I know that's not true. We never saw Mark again. But sometimes in the dead of winter, when the wind is just right, I swear I still hear him whispering my name.
Story number 5.
The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the thin nylon walls of Jake's tent. The blizzard had come in faster than expected, swallowing the pine forest in a whiteout. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just him, his fiancée, Lauren, and their best friends, Matt and Sophie. But now they were trapped in a snowstorm in the middle of the Rockies, miles from civilization. Jake checked his watch. Midnight. He listened carefully but could only hear the storm's relentless fury. Lauren lay beside him, her breathing shallow, her body curled beneath a thick sleeping bag. He reached out, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. She was a light sleeper, but exhaustion had taken its toll. A distant sound pricked at the edge of his hearing, a crunching noise, snow being compacted underfoot. He tensed. Matt and Sophie were in their tent a few yards away, but they wouldn't be walking around in this cold. Maybe a deer? Or something larger? He held his breath. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling their tent. Jake sat up carefully, gripping the flashlight beside him. He clicked it on and aimed it toward the thin fabric of the tent's walls. The beam cast distorted shadows, but there was nothing. He exhaled, scolding himself for letting the storm play tricks on his mind. Then, something brushed against the tent. A whispering scrape, like fingers trailing along the surface. Jake's blood turned to ice. He turned toward Lauren, shaking her gently. "Lauren, wake up," he hissed. She groaned, but didn't open her eyes. The noise came again, a dragging sound. Something, or someone, moving past the tent entrance. Jake's heart pounded as he unzipped the tent door just an inch, peering outside. The snowstorm obscured everything beyond a few feet, but in the dim glow of the moonlight, he saw them. Footprints, leading in circles around their tent, vanishing into the white void. But there was something wrong. The prints weren't human. They were elongated, deep, as if something had heavy, clawed feet. And they didn't start from anywhere. They just appeared. A sudden gust of wind shook the tent, and from the storm came a sound that didn't belong to the wind. An eerie, low moan, almost like someone calling for help. Jake scrambled backward, zipping the tent shut. "Lauren, wake up!" This time, she stirred. What's wrong?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "There's something out there," he whispered. She sat up, groggy, but her face changed when she saw his expression. "What do you mean?" Another moan carried through the storm, closer this time. It was unmistakably human. Lauren gasped. "Someone's out there." Jake hesitated. It didn't sound right. It was too hollow, too stretched, but before he could stop her, Lauren unzipped the tent and shined her flashlight outside. The snow reflected the beam harshly, but the swirling whiteout revealed a figure in the distance, a man. He was standing completely still, wearing nothing but a tattered jacket and jeans. His skin was pale, almost gray, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Sir?" Lauren called, her voice trembling. The man didn't move. Jake pulled her back inside. "That's not right," he said. "But I don't think he's human." Lauren shivered, clinging to Jake as the moaning sound returned, except now it was layered like multiple voices calling in unison. A sudden scream split through the night. Sophie. Jake and Lauren burst out of the tent, blinded momentarily by the snow. Matt and Sophie's tent was unzipped, flapping violently in the wind. Matt was standing in front of it, his flashlight shaking. "She's gone," he yelled. Jake ran to him. "What do you mean gone?" She left the tent. I woke up and she was just standing outside. I called her name, but she wouldn't answer. She just walked into the storm." Lauren grabbed his arm. "We saw someone out there, a man." Matt's face drained of color. "What?" Before anyone could respond, another scream tore through the night. This time it was Sophie's voice, but it wasn't coming from the distance. It was coming from all around them. The three of them turned in every direction. The wind carried Sophie's voice like an echo, repeating, twisting, overlapping itself until it was no longer just Sophie. There were other voices in the mix, crying, whispering, calling. Then Matt dropped his flashlight. Because Sophie was standing right in front of him. She was barefoot in the snow, her dark hair soaked with frost, her lips slightly parted. But her eyes were wrong. "Matt," Lauren whispered. Sophie smiled. It was unnatural, too wide, too forced. Then she whispered something. "Let's go deeper." Matt reached for her, but Jake yanked him back. "No, that's not Sophie." Matt resisted. "But Sophie wouldn't smile like that. Look at her eyes. Matt hesitated, his breath coming in panicked bursts. Sophie's head twitched to the side, just a little too far, as if something inside her was misaligned. Then she took a step forward. Lauren grabbed Jake's arm. Jake, her feet. Look at her feet. They all looked down. Sophie's footprints didn't match hers. They were the same ones Jake had seen earlier. Elongated, clawed. And the snow beneath them wasn't melting from her skin. Jake grabbed Matt and yanked him backward. Run! They sprinted toward the trees, the wind screaming around them. The snow stung their faces, the cold stealing their breath. Behind them, Sophie's voice called out, sweet and inviting. Don't leave me. Jake didn't look back. He didn't dare. They ran blindly, deeper into the forest, until their legs gave out and they collapsed behind a fallen tree. Their chests heaved, their bodies frozen to the core. Silence. Only the storm remained. Matt sobbed quietly, burying his face in his hands. She's gone. She's really gone. Lauren clung to Jake, her body trembling. What was that? What happened to her? Jake didn't answer. He didn't have one. Then, just as he thought the nightmare had ended, a soft voice drifted through the trees. Not from the distance, from right behind them. Why did you run? They turned. Sophie was standing there, her wide smile splitting her face, her head tilting just a little too far, and she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the shadows of the trees, were dozens of figures. Pale, frozen, watching. Jake opened his mouth to scream. The storm swallowed them whole.